What would you do if the town your father died protecting threw you into a blizzard with nothing but a duffel bag, a scarred body, and the white shepherd that had followed you through war, and that dog refused the road to safety because he could hear something alive beneath a frozen lake? The retired Navy SEAL had spent years learning how to move toward gunfire without hesitation, but coming home had always frightened him more than combat, because home remembered the boy he had been before grief, before enlistment, before all the cold private rooms where he had learned that survival could feel a lot like punishment. He came back to the mountain town with his shoulders bent not by age but by what age had done to memory, carrying military papers, his father's death notice, and the stale certainty that he would sign what needed signing, clear out the old ridge cabin, and disappear again before anyone found a way to make him stay. The town did not greet him with sympathy. It watched him the way mountain towns watch storms, with narrowed eyes and a practical wish that whatever trouble had come over the pass would move on quickly without tearing anything valuable loose. His father had been a hard man even before the weather made him harder, the kind who trusted sirens, radios, snowpack reports, and old mining maps more than he trusted conversations, and when the county found his body near the upper spill road, half buried and already freezing into the posture of a warning no one intended to hear, the official report said he slipped, struck stone, and died alone. But nothing about the retired SEAL's father had ever died alone. He had died fighting everything: weather, debt, the town board, the developer pushing a luxury winter resort into unstable slopes, and most of all the truth that he had spent years failing the people who still carried his name. If you believe loyalty can still drag a broken man back toward purpose, then this journey on Storm Rescue Tales is for you, because the night this story began, the only thing standing between a greedy town and a grave of ice was a man who had already lost too much and a shepherd who still believed he could be useful. The reading of the will lasted less than 20 minutes and destroyed whatever little dignity the day had started with. The town lawyer, nervous as a rabbit in open snow, slid papers across a table and explained that the ridge cabin and the lake access parcel had been tied up under back taxes, utility liens, and a revised deed the father had apparently signed 2 months earlier, transferring conditional control of the land to the developer in exchange for debt relief and seasonal maintenance promises that now sounded laughable in the dry office air. The retired CO read every line twice, felt the old operational calm come down over his anger, and noticed immediately what the others hoped grief would blur. The signature on the transfer did not lean the way his father's hand always leaned after his shoulder injury, and the witness line carried the sheriff's name. When he said the deed was forged, the sheriff only smiled the way weak men smiled when they borrowed power from someone richer. The developer stood near the office heater in a tailored winter coat that probably cost more than the old ridge truck outside, his face arranged in thoughtful regret, telling everyone there that the mountain took enough from people without family making things harder, that he was willing to let the returning veteran gather personal belongings before the resort survey team fenced the upper road, that no one wanted to make this painful. Then the cousin who had spent a lifetime orbiting stronger men for scraps of importance stepped in and did what cowards did when cruelty was finally legal enough to perform in public. He picked up the veteran's duffel, carried it to the front steps, and threw it into the snow. "Nothing up there belongs to you now," he said. The room went still. The shepherd, who had been waiting by the truck because he hated offices and the trapped smell of fear inside them, lifted his head the second the bag hit the drift and let out a growl so low and steady that even the sheriff glanced toward the door. No one tried to stop what came next. Not the lawyer. Not the clerk. Not the older men along the wall who had once clapped the boy on the back after football games and then years later pinned yellow ribbons to the hardware store when he deployed. They all stood there and let a decorated veteran be thrown out into a storm cycle rolling down from the ridge because the developer paid for the clinic roof, the snowplow fuel, the scholarship fund, the church repairs, and in places like that gratitude often learned to kneel before the wrong altar. The retired SEAL bent, picked up his bag, brushed snow from the photographs and discharge papers inside, and said nothing because silence had become his most dangerous habit. He drove to the ridge anyway. The upper road was already glazing over, wind carving white snakes across the switchbacks, and the shepherd sat upright in the passenger seat with his pale eyes fixed on the mountain the way he did when the world was about to make a decision nobody would like. The cabin was darker than memory and colder than grief. A new padlock hung broken from the woodshed. Tire tracks crossed the yard where no county truck should have been. Inside, most of his father's things were still there, but the locked strongbox was missing, the avalanche maps on the wall had been stripped down to nails, and the old battery radio on the table had one page torn from the logbook. The dog moved through the rooms with rising agitation, inhaling floorboards, corners, stove ash, the mudroom, then returning again and again to the back threshold where the snow outside held the shallow scars of something heavy dragged toward the lake trail. When the veteran stepped out onto the porch, the whole mountain seemed to lean and listen. Blackwater Lake spread below the cabin like a frozen sheet of tarnished steel, half hidden by fir trees and storm smoke, and beyond it the eastern ridge rose toward the abandoned gold mine works that the developer had spent the last year trying to reopen under the lie of tourism. His father used to say that mountain was lazy until men touched it, then vengeful. The veteran looked down at the lake and saw two things at once: old snowmobile tracks curving toward the shore, and a strange darker seam across the ice where wind had polished one long line almost black. Behind him glass shattered. A bottle full of fuel burst through the kitchen window and turned the curtains into orange claws. The second bottle hit before he reached the door. The cabin that had held every stubborn, miserable winter of his father's life went up in a rush of heat so sudden it pushed him backward into the snow. Men were shouting from the tree line, but the storm was already chewing their words apart. He grabbed the duffel, the rolled map case he found by instinct, and reached for the shepherd, thinking the dog would bolt downhill toward the road like any creature with sense left in him. Instead, the shepherd spun once, stared straight toward Blackwater Lake, and ran. The veteran cursed, coughed smoke, and followed because there are only two kinds of decisions in a blizzard, the ones you make and the ones your fear makes for you, and he had already spent too many years letting fear choose. The trail to the lake had not been cleared in seasons. Snow came to the knee, then the thigh. Branches slapped his face. Behind him, his father's cabin cracked inward and sent a plume of sparks climbing the dark. Ahead, the shepherd flashed white between tree trunks, then vanished, then appeared again farther downslope, not fleeing but guiding, always checking back, always pulling him onward. By the time he reached the shore, his lungs felt sawed raw and his hands had gone numb inside wet gloves. The shepherd stood 10 yards out on the frozen lake, barking at the black seam in the ice. When the veteran stepped onto the surface, he expected the familiar dead echo of winter-thick ice. Instead, he heard hollow iron below his boots. He dropped to one knee, scraped snow away, and saw the truth under the clear blue crust, a rusted steel hatch ringed by old bolts, and beneath the ice beneath that, a second impossible thing, a deep amber glimmer stacked in bars or bricks far below black water, as if the frozen lake had laid one eye open just long enough to show him what men had been willing to kill for. Then something hammered 3 times from underneath the hatch, and a voice, thin with cold and terror, rose through the iron. "Please," it cried. "If you're not one of them, don't leave us buried." He had learned in war that a voice begging through steel could ruin a man faster than any bullet if he arrived 1 second too late, and the sound rising from under Blackwater Lake hit him with that same cruel urgency, a human plea flattened by metal, depth, and cold until it sounded almost less like speech than survival itself. The shepherd dug first, claws scraping snow from the hatch rim with frantic purpose, while the retired SEAL dropped beside him and ripped at the ice with the butt of his pistol until the crust shattered in sharp blue plates around the ring handle. The men who burned the cabin were still somewhere in the timber behind him, maybe circling, maybe already thinking the fire had done enough, but that no longer mattered because a person was under the lake and his dog had chosen a side. He wrapped both hands around the ring, braced his boots, and heaved. At first nothing moved except pain through his shoulder. Then rust screamed, bolts groaned, and the hatch rose through the ice with a blast of warmer air carrying the smell of oil, damp stone, old wood, and recent fear. A ladder dropped into darkness. The shepherd did not hesitate. He plunged through the opening and vanished into the shaft as if he had known all along that the lake had a throat. The veteran followed with the map tube strapped across his back and the duffel slung high, sealing the hatch above them as best he could against the storm before descending into a world no town rumor had ever fully described. 20 feet below the ice the shaft opened into an old dewatering tunnel built back when black water mines still mattered enough for engineers to believe it would live forever. Rusted pipes ran along the walls. Emergency lamps glowed weakly from a battery rig someone had set up recently. The floor was wet, but not abandoned wet. Used wet. The shepherd stood at the far end before a cage gate that had been cut open with a torch. Beyond it, a chamber flickered with lantern light. The veteran stepped through and found a woman sitting upright against stacked sacks with one arm in a sling, a bruise darkening the side of her face, and a revolver held in both shaking hands. She could not have been much older than him, but the mountain had written harder years on her skin than birthdays alone could explain. Beside her sat a boy of maybe 12 in a coat too big for him, not her son by blood perhaps, but hers by responsibility now, the kind of half-frozen responsibility storms invented. At the sight of the shepherd, the boy's fear cracked open into stunned relief, and the woman lowered the gun 2 inches without lowering her eyes. "Your father said if anyone came," she said, "it would either be the sheriff with a lie or his son with that dog." The veteran stood very still, because hearing his father's faith after the man was dead felt like being handed a blade by a ghost. "Where is he?" he asked. The woman looked away first. "Dead if the mountain was kinder than the men above it." He swallowed that and moved closer. The boy reached for the shepherd, and the dog, who could distinguish panic from threat better than most medics could, lowered himself immediately so the child's hands found fur and steadiness in the same motion. The woman's eyes softened at that, only for a second. "He found us 3 nights ago," she said. "Pulled us out of an upper drift before their lookout made another round. He got me here, set the shoulder, brought food, swore he'd get proof out and come back with help." Her good hand gestured toward a steel case on the floor. "I don't think help got to him first." The veteran crouched beside the case and opened it. Inside lay survey overlays, blasting schedules, photographs of core samples, county permit copies, and one spiral notebook filled in the cramped mechanical handwriting of a field geologist who had spent her life trying to make unstable land tell the truth. He understood enough at a glance to feel dread climb into him with precise cold feet. The developer had not just been drilling test shafts for a resort lodge and ski lift access. He had been punching exploratory boreholes into old mining chambers beneath Blackwater Lake, chasing the legend every child in town grew up hearing and every adult pretended not to believe, that when the first winter collapse hit the mine in 1937, the payroll gold went down with the east vein and was never recovered. But the geologist's notes were not about gold. They were about fracture lines, thaw pockets, shifting load, water pressure under the basin, and one sentence underlined so hard it had nearly cut the paper: "Any blast under the east shelf risks full basin failure under winter weight." "He knows," the veteran said. The woman laughed once, bitter and exhausted. "Knowing is why he's dangerous." She told the story in pieces because pain took her breath and the boy kept trembling every time boots thudded overhead in memory, but by the end the shape was clear. She had been the county's contract geologist on the Basin Expansion Survey, one of the only people in town who still put data above donors. When her reports started showing that the developers' blasting and unauthorized drilling were undermining the ridge above the lake, she took the findings to the county office. The sheriff stalled. The board delayed. The developer invited her to dinner, smiled, and told her she was smart enough to understand that every town survived by choosing which truths it could afford. A week later 2 maintenance workers vanished after a night shift near the old shaft road. Then a third went missing. She kept digging. She found receipts tying the developer's crews to off-record explosives, an old federal map showing a sealed underlake dewatering corridor no private survey should have known about, and one more thing, evidence that the mine legend was true: the gold had never been lost. It had been trapped in an emergency vault below the ice when the first collapse forced a flood seal through the payroll chamber. The developer didn't just want the mine. He wanted what the lake had kept. "He took me from the county truck on the upper road," she said, voice flattening at the edges. Told me if I showed him where the old vault key sequence was hidden, he might let the boy live. The boy stared at the shepherd's fur and said nothing. The veteran looked at him then. The child had the drawn, hollow face of somebody who had not slept safely in too long. "Where are your parents?" he asked quietly. The woman answered for him. "His father disappeared in the first crew loss. His mother left town years ago. I've been pretending there was a legal process for him, but the truth is I was keeping him close because the mountain wasn't the only thing hunting evidence." The veteran felt anger settle into the clean, cold shape that made him effective, not a flare, not a shout, but a usable instrument. The shepherd's head snapped toward the ceiling. A second later everyone heard it, a vibration running through the tunnel supports from somewhere above, not quite an explosion, not yet collapse, but machinery and drilling where no machinery should still have been operating in a storm this bad. The woman's face went white. "He started early," she said. "If he breaches the old pressure gallery before the lake freezes deeper, the whole basin could shear." The veteran checked the geologist's notes, the father's folded map tucked in the tube, the lantern light, the tunnel lines. "Is there a way to the vault?" She met his eyes. "There's a way to everything under this mountain. The problem is he knows most of them now." The shepherd barked once at the rear gate. It wasn't warning. It was discovery. The veteran moved toward him and found fresh water seeping under the threshold from a side passage that should have been dry according to the printed plan. Warm seep. Pressure change. Above them the drilling thudded again, closer, harder, and with it came the low metallic report of a charged box being tested, one click, then another, like a countdown practiced by men who thought winter buried sound as easily as bodies. The woman pushed herself up against the sacks, pale with pain but still made of something stronger than fear. "If you go after the gold first," she said, "you'll die rich and the town will die with you." The veteran looked at the shepherd, at the boy, at the lake dripping through the tunnel roof, and made the only decision a man could make when he had already seen what money did to cowards. "Then we don't go after the gold first," he said. "We go after the living." The shepherd bared his teeth at the dark passage like he had been waiting all night to hear exactly that. Then, from somewhere beyond the next steel door, there came a sound that changed everything again, not drilling, not water, but 3 dull human blows from behind locked metal, and a muffled voice crying that there were more people trapped in the old work chamber, and the ice overhead had already begun to crack. The mountain had stopped being a mystery and become a timetable, and the retired SEAL knew enough about bad timetables to understand that every minute spent choosing was its own kind of surrender. He took the geologist's notes, stripped the steel case down to what mattered most, pressure maps, blasting locations, a hand-sketched gate sequence, photographs, then wrapped the rest in oilcloth and wedged it high into a pipe recess in case the tunnel flooded or they had to run light. The woman protested when he told her to stay with the boy for 30 seconds while he checked the trapped workers himself, but the shepherd made the argument for him by planting beside them both, broad chest out, refusing to leave until the child's hand found his ruff again. "He'll come back for you," the woman told the boy, though it sounded like she was telling herself too. The veteran pushed through the steel door Atlas had marked and entered a low work gallery lined with crates, old compressors, and the kind of improvised wiring that turned greed into fire. At the far end a chain-link tool cage had been repurposed into a holding pen. Inside, 2 maintenance men in dirty reflective jackets were slumped against each other under emergency blankets, one gray-faced from blood loss where a beam had pinned and skinned his leg, the other shaking uncontrollably from cold and fear. The one still strong enough to speak saw the veteran and grabbed the fencing with both hands. "He said the storm would bury us and call it a cave-in," he rasped. "Please tell me the dog made it out." The veteran almost smiled at the order of that sentence. "The dog made it out," he said, and cut the chain. The stronger man nearly cried at that. The other just closed his eyes in exhausted relief. While he worked the trapped leg free with a pry bar, the veteran learned in broken pieces what the town had refused to know all winter. The developers' crews had found more than old or down here. They found the sealed payroll vault, a reinforced chamber under the lake ice where the company had stored gold bars before the 1937 collapse trapped the access corridor, and the owners told the town it was gone forever. The developer had spent months moving salvage out at night, blaming the noise on geothermal drilling for the future resort. When the geologist started connecting subsurface instability to those secret operations, he moved faster. The missing workers weren't runaways. They were men who saw loaded bars and heard too much. Some had been paid to keep quiet. Some had not survived long enough to want payment. The trapped men had argued when the developer ordered charges set under the east shelf before dawn, saying the lake was under too much winter load and the first collapse would reach town. The developer called them replaceable and locked them in the cage. The veteran had heard variants of that sentence his whole adult life, in different countries, under different flags, but the ugliest thing about it here was how familiar the man saying it would sound on Main Street when he donated a school roof or shook a widow's hand. He got the injured worker onto his feet with the stronger man as support, then led them back to the woman and the boy. The geologist took one look at the injuries and switched from fear to work, tearing strips from a blanket, checking pupils, splinting the leg tighter with a broken handle. "We can't move fast with all four," she said. "Then we don't move blind," the veteran answered. He spread the map case over a crate and studied the underlake system while the shepherd paced its edges like a living compass. The father's annotations turned the official diagrams into something almost tender, warning circles around weak pillars, notes about airflow, old service lifts, emergency bypasses, handwritten reminders to trust the north bore only when the pressure room was dry. Among them the veteran found one line scrawled harder than the rest: "If east shelf goes, open west spill first or town dies before morning." The geologist saw it too and went silent. "He figured it out," she whispered. The veteran looked at her. The veteran heard it a half-second later, rushing water where there should have been only trickle, not basin failure yet but someone opening a relief gate deliberately to flood the lower approach routes. The developer was sealing the mountain behind his operation. "Move," the veteran said. The choice was brutal and simple. The trapped workers could not survive a high-speed tunnel run, and the boy could not survive another collapse if they dragged him through the deepest route. The only viable exit was the north maintenance ladder to the old Deacon Trail above St. Jude Chapel, but that meant crossing a dewatering crawl that had not been used since the post-war repairs. The stronger worker took one look at the injured man and said what decent men say when the world goes bad and there are too few hands. "Take the kid and the maps," he said. "Come back." The veteran ignored him because promises to return were cheap in places like this unless you moved people first. He redistributed weight, slung the map case and notes across his own back, gave the boy a glow stick, handed the stronger worker the pistol after checking the chamber, and told him he would be rear security if anyone came through the flood side. The shepherd settled the order of movement on his own, taking point, then pausing every few yards to look back, making sure the slowest legs remained inside his world. The crawl began as a utility tube and became, by necessity and age, something uglier. Men had patched leaks here with steel plates, timber braces, even old or car panels bolted against the rock. In two places they had to push the injured worker on a door slab over shallow freezing water while the shepherd moved ahead across the metal and turned back, barking once if a plate shifted wrong beneath weight. The boy fell twice. The second time he did not rise until Atlas returned to him, pressing muzzle to cheek the way he had in the first tunnel panic, giving the child something warm and alive to follow instead of the dark. The geologist watched that with an expression the veteran knew too well, the look of someone remembering what hope cost and deciding to pay anyway. They reached the north ladder just as the first real shock wave hit the system. Somewhere under the east shelf, explosives went off in sequence, not one blast but a chain, and the whole crawl twisted with the deep obscene sound of bedrock being forced into a new opinion. Dust choked the air. The injured worker screamed as the door slab tilted and jammed his leg. Water burst from a side seam and went from ankle depth to knee depth in less than 10 seconds. "Up!" the veteran shouted. The ladder climbed in iron darkness toward a hatch his father had marked chapel access, and above them it was the shepherd, not the veteran, who reached it first, leaping the final rung platform and hurling his weight against the warped steel until the latch gave under brute insistence and ancient rust. Cold white dawn blue stormlight cut down the shaft. The veteran hauled the boy upward, then the geologist, then helped drag the injured worker one rung at a time while water rose below. By the time he climbed out himself into the ruined sacristy behind St. Jude Chapel, the tunnel mouth under the floor was gushing like a wound. The chapel stood on the lee side of the ridge, its broken steeple clawing at a sky so full of snow it looked solid. The town lay below through trees and drifting white, still lit in sleepy yellow patches, still alive because no one yet understood what the mountain had started becoming. On the altar rails sat a lantern. Beside it a thermos. And tacked into the old hymn board with a hunting knife was one more note in the father's hand. It read, "If he throws you out, let the dog choose the road." Under that were 3 more words that stopped the veteran colder than the storm ever could, under the saint. Then the chapel doors burst open inward under a gust and a woman in a paramedic parka stumbled in with a shotgun in one hand, blood at her hairline, and fury in her eyes so immediate and personal that for a second the veteran felt all the years between them collapse like thin ice. She saw him, saw the shepherd, saw the geologist and the boy, and whatever else she had prepared to say broke apart. "He found you," she whispered, looking not at the veteran but at the dog. Then her face hardened again. "Good. Because the sheriff didn't come alone, and if we don't find what's under the saint before the next blast, this whole town is already dead." He had once imagined, in the years when memory still made mistakes on purpose, that if he ever saw the woman again there would be time enough for the old ache to arrive slowly, a look across a parking lot, a breath caught in surprise, maybe a word that tested whether the wound between them had scarred or stayed open. Instead he saw her in a ruined chapel with blood at her temple, powder burns on one sleeve, and a shotgun in her hands, and the old ache did not arrive slowly at all. It came like weather breaking over a ridge. She had been the one person in that town who used to meet his silence with her own without turning either into a challenge. Years earlier, before war rearranged his nerve endings and before his father's neglect made leaving feel easier than staying, she had been the medic trainee who rode avalanche calls with his father and treated busted wrists in the school gym, the one who knew every winter road by memory and every old widow by name. Now she was the backbone of the clinic, and the only person his father trusted enough to write into a storm plan. She set the shotgun against the pew, crossed the aisle in 3 fast steps, and pressed the clean cloth into the geologist's hand before checking the injured worker's leg with brutal competence. "Talk while I work," she said. "I've got state dispatch every 12 minutes when the ridge interference eases, but the sheriff has county frequencies and the developer has half the plow fleet waiting for his orders." The veteran gave her the short version because long versions were luxuries the mountain was charging interest on. The bunker. The trapped workers. The vault under the lake. The detonations. The split spillway key system. The geologist added the engineering details and clipped exhausted phrases, enough to make the medic's face set into the kind of stillness professionals got when panic had to be filed for later. "Then the second key is what your father died trying to keep out of their hands," she said, glancing toward the statue alcove at the front of the church. "He came to me last night with a broken wrist and blood in his beard, said if he didn't make it back I was to trust 2 things only, your dog's instincts and your worst habits." The veteran let out the smallest breath that might have been a laugh if he had not been so tired. "That's not flattering." "No," she said, meeting his eyes for the first time. "It's accurate." The shepherd had gone to the stone saint at the side altar, a weather-worn figure half hidden in candle wax and dust, and was pawing once at the base. Under the saint. The veteran moved the kneeler, then the cracked offering box, and found an iron ring sunk into the floorboard seam. He hauled. A hidden hatch rose, opening into a stone cavity between chapel foundation blocks where old mission records and emergency sacrament wine had probably once been hidden. Now the cavity held a steel lockbox wrapped in oilcloth, a rosary black with age, and a military brass lever stamped with the same civil defense mark as the dewatering shaft below the lake. The geologist almost sagged with relief. "That's the chapel key." The medic wasn't looking at the lever. She was looking at the veteran. If the sheriff has the archive key already, they only need that one to force the full release system. He knew before she said it that the mountain would not allow a clean race. The next shot through the stained glass side window proved him right. Colored glass exploded over the pews. The shepherd barked once, violent and immediate, and moved between the boy and the opening before the second round punched splinters out of the confessional wall. The veteran dropped, drew the pistol taken from the worker, and saw movement through the storm outside, 3 men at least, maybe 4, spread among the headstones and drifted evergreens. Not raiders now. Hunters. The medic racked the shotgun and fired through the blown pane, driving one dark figure behind the cemetery wall. He doesn't want to storm the front, she said. He wants to pin us here until the ridge gives him the rest. The veteran knew the tactic because he had used versions of it himself. Fix the target, close the exits, let environment, fear, or time perform the expensive part. The problem for the developer was the same as it had always been when he put armed men against people with something real to protect. He kept mistaking endurance for weakness. The veteran crawled to the side sacristy door, while the medic kept the front line honest. The shepherd tracked him immediately, body low and ready, every movement balanced between command discipline and personal fury. "Stay with the boy," the veteran said. The dog ignored him. The boy's small voice came from behind the pew. "Let him go. He knows where they're thinking." It was such a strange sentence from a child that for 1 second the veteran simply looked at him. Then he nodded and kicked the sacristy door open into the storm. A masked gunman rounded the corner at the same instant, rifle half raised, and the shepherd launched with a force no human body ever saw coming in time. The man went down hard under white fur, paws, and teeth stopping just shy of the throat, while the veteran drove the rifle away and buried the man's face in the drift. Behind them the chapel bell clanged once as another blast shook the ridge. Snow fell from the steeple rafters like sifted flour. The geologist went pale. "He's not just setting charges on the shelf anymore," she said. "He's starting the pressure cascade." She spread her notes over the pew and jabbed a finger at the sketched cross-section. "If he triggers the east shelf while the lower basin stays locked, the lake lode pushes into the townside fracture, and the whole main street line drops. If he forces both keys and opens the wrong gates, the release channel cuts through the valley floor and takes the houses anyway. The only safe sequence is west first, south second, manual timing, under 90 seconds once pressure starts to move." The medic looked from the notes to the hidden lockbox papers to the veteran, and there it was, the shape of the impossible. 2 separate control chambers under the mountain. 1 timed window. 1 chance. And outside, men tightening a circle because the developer knew enough to fear what happened if the right people got below him first. The stronger worker, pale but upright now, checked the borrowed pistol and said he could hold the rear corridor if somebody showed him where. The injured worker could barely stand. The boy clung to the shepherd as if the dog had become not comfort but law. The veteran knew exactly what came next and hated it before the words were spoken. "We split," he said. The medic didn't like it, which was one reason he trusted her more than the board. "No," she said at once. "We divide under this mountain and he picks us off by tunnel." "Not if we stop using his map," the veteran answered. He unfolded the father's hand-marked overlay beside the geologist's notes, and saw what old wintermen saw in systems, not lines on paper but habits of use, forgotten ladders, maintenance crawlways, priest paths, vent runs, and the one north drainage trench not shown on the county copies because county copies had been cleaned for public comfort decades ago. His father had kept the dirtier version. The chapel crawlspace rejoins the lower service trench above west control. South vault can be reached from the old burial drain behind the cemetery wall. He'll expect everyone to run toward the main spill corridor. We don't. The geologist stared at the map, then slowly nodded. This could work. The medic took that in, then took the shotgun, then took a long breath that looked almost like acceptance. "Then you and I are the two." The veteran started to refuse out of pure reflex, a useless urge to keep her above ground and uninvolved, but she cut him off before it formed. "I know the townside line, I know the chapel drains, and I know how to keep breathing when a man with money thinks he's better at deciding who survives than the storm is." There was history in her voice, not romantic, not nostalgic, simply earned. The boy tightened his hold on the shepherd. The veteran looked down at the dog and felt the old war ache open again, because if the boy went to West Control with the medic and geologist, and the veteran took south by the burial drain, the shepherd could not be in both places. He knelt and put one hand against the animal's neck. The dog's pale eyes held his with that unbearable attentiveness that always made commands feel like confessions. "Guard the boy," he said softly. The shepherd did not move. "Guard," he repeated, sharper. For 1 second he saw refusal, not disobedience exactly, but grief. Then the dog turned, pressed himself against the child's side, and fixed his gaze on the medic as if transferring obedience through love. The boy buried his face in the white fur. Outside, the developer's voice rose over the storm from somewhere near the cemetery wall, smooth even now, carrying farther than a decent man's voice should have in weather like that. "You can save the mountain," he called. "Or you can save the people under it. But not both." The veteran stood with the brass lever in one hand, his father's dirty map in the other, and answered under his breath where only the chapel, the storm, and his dog could hear him. "Watch me." Then the back wall of St. Jude shook under a truck slamming the doors, and the race under the mountain began. The crawl space beneath St. Jude had once carried sacramental wine, condemned hymnals, and the kind of private prayers old priests preferred to hide where no parishioner would ever see them, but winter had repurposed it the way winter repurposed everything, turning sanctity into infrastructure, memory into passage, and desperation into direction. The veteran went first through the burial drain cut, sliding the brass lever into the duffel tube so both hands stayed free, while behind him the medic led the geologist, the boy, the stronger worker, and the shepherd through the priest path toward West Control. They had agreed on no speeches, only sequence. If West moved, the medic would call. If she didn't call, he would know the mountain had chosen another answer. The burial drain descended through stone lined with moss, old frost, and the stale smell of standing water. It was not built for a broad-shouldered man in a storm coat, and more than once he had to strip off layers and shove them ahead just to slide through the rock throat. Above him the church groaned under impact and wind. Somewhere outside trucks were moving, men shouting, plows grinding, but those human sounds already felt smaller than the mountain's deeper language, the continuing low fracture of a shelf beginning to betray its own weight. He emerged at last into a maintenance trench barely 3 feet wide running alongside the spilled channel wall. Pipes sweated. Ice feathered every bolt. And 40 yards ahead, through the iron lattice, he could see South Vault, dark, waiting, not yet reached by anyone on either side. He also saw what the developer had done with his head start. 2 charge cases had been set against the trench brace, not enough to collapse the full channel but enough to bury a single man in the access run and seal the safer route. The detonator line had already been laid. The veteran felt the old clean stillness come down over him. He unpacked one cutter from the duffel, flattened himself in the trench water, and crawled. In another life he had disarmed bombs under more foreign skies, but greed had a familiar wiring style. The developer's men had used commercial cord, cold stiff and obvious where it crossed the brace in a shallow groove. He clipped it, pulled the secondary line from the cap, and eased the case free 1 inch at a time until his own heartbeat was the loudest thing in the trench. When he finally set the charge aside, a voice reached him faint through the radio at his vest. "West chamber in sight," the medic said, breathless, steady enough. He exhaled once and kept moving. South Vault opened with the same hydraulic sigh his father's notes had described, and inside he found not abandonment but recent use. Tool marks scarred the lever pedestal. Empty fuel cans lay stacked by the wall. One of the dead analog gauges had been replaced with a digital pressure monitor running off a battery bank. The developer had been here often enough to modernize the lie while pretending the mountain was just another parcel line. The veteran inserted the brass lever but did not pull. He checked the notes again. West first. 90 seconds from movement. South second. Hold until pressure stabilized below red. Simple on paper, murderous in rock. Over the radio came gunfire, close, contained, then the medic cursing with the flat rage of someone too busy to be afraid. "Company at West," she said. Static swallowed the rest. The veteran pressed his hand flat against the cold steel and made the decision not to run yet. Trust either existed before a timed window, or it did not exist at all. He stayed on the lever and counted his own pulse until the radio came alive again, not with the medic's voice but with the geologist's, clipped, fast, and more exhausted than before. "Bypass jammed? The marker lies. Tell her to kick the left panel before she pulls." The veteran repeated it into the line. A second passed. Then another. Then the shepherd barked. Not near the radio. Near him. He turned and saw white fur at the south vault doorway, the dog alone, chest heaving, snow melting into beads along his whiskers. For a wild moment he thought the shepherd had disobeyed and abandoned the boy, but the radio answered with the child's crying in the background and the medic saying, "He warned us before they rounded the bend. He dropped the deputy. He came back. We're still here." Then the line crackled, broke, and reformed under new violence. A gunshot, a man shouting orders, the geologist yelling over machinery, the shepherd in the doorway staring not at the lever, not at him, but upward toward the ladder shaft concealed behind the pump housing. The dog barked once, hard command instead of fear. The veteran stared. The south vault was still the critical point. Yet Atlas had abandoned West at the exact second he could have stayed where the boy needed him most. That meant only one thing. The dog had found the real threat. The radio snapped alive again with the medic shouting, "The sheriff's here." Another shot. Then nothing but static. The veteran went. He sprinted through the service corridor toward West Control, boots skidding on burst ice, and hit the chamber just as the sheriff raised his pistol for a second shot and the shepherd launched into the deputy's arm. The next few seconds happened with the brutal economy of every necessary fight he had ever survived. He crashed the sheriff into the railing, tore the pistol loose, drove him down face first, then kicked the jammed bypass panel at the geologist's shouted direction until it blew open with a rusted clang. The medic reached the lever. The geologist called the count. The stronger worker kept the rear tunnel with the borrowed pistol. The boy clung to the shepherd with one hand and covered one ear with the other while the chambers shook under the first movement of buried hydraulics waking after decades. "West moving!" the geologist yelled. The veteran ran before the words finished, because 90 seconds in a failing mountain was not time but debt. He hit south at 88, forced the brass lever down, and felt the whole basin answer through steel, rock, and blood. The pressure gauge leapt red. He held. Water screamed through the pipes. Above, another blast shook the mountain so hard the light fixtures went black and came back red. Then the dog was there again, absurd, impossible, standing alone in the south doorway with his whole body aimed toward the hidden upper ladder. The veteran's skin went cold. That was where the developer had gone. Not to west, not to south, but up, to the crown house above the spillway where one final manual detonation could turn the whole corrected sequence into a mass grave. The radio came alive with the geologist's voice. "Gauge falling but not enough." The medic took over. "I can hold west if Ellie talks me through it." "Go." He looked at the lever, at the red needle 1 hair below disaster, then at the dog who had chosen this exact moment to disobey only if disobedience meant saving everyone. Once, long ago, he had left a man bleeding in a collapsing stairwell because orders and timing said the bigger objective mattered more. He had lived with that decision so long it felt like scar tissue around the heart. He was not making its twin now. "Hold the count," he told the radio. "I'm taking the dog." He followed Atlas up the maintenance shaft into darkness, and above them the mountain began to break for real. The upper ladder was steeper than any sane engineer would have approved and narrower than a man with combat wounds should have trusted at speed, but the retired SEAL climbed anyway because fear was no longer deciding anything in his life that still mattered. The shaft smelled of rust, mouse nests, stale insulation, and winter air forcing itself through breaches too small for daylight, and every rung carried him closer not only to the developer's last move but to the oldest part of his own private wreckage, the place where one dead medic still waited in a collapsed stairwell every time stakes and timing collided. The shepherd climbed with the impossible certainty only working dogs seem to possess, not hurrying blindly, not wasting motion, checking platforms, pausing at weak metal, then moving on the instant he judged it safe enough. Twice the dog barked, and the veteran stopped just in time to avoid putting full weight on rungs furred with black ice. In another life under another command, someone would have called that animal instinct and moved on. He knew better. Atlas listened before he acted. That was the dog's truest gift. Midway up the shaft the red emergency lights failed and the veteran's flashlight took over, cutting a narrow blade through dust and old steel. The beam caught faded maintenance arrows, old dates scratched into the paint by long-dead workers, and once, impossibly, his father's handwriting on the wall beside a pressure hatch, "If you hear the lake humming, the ridge is lying." He touched the words without slowing and felt grief pass through him like current, not weakening him this time, but clarifying him. At the top of the climb the shaft opened into a crawl chase filled with pipes and service lines that ran like buried veins toward the spillway Crown House. The wind already lived in there, moaning through a breach ahead. Snow drifted in thin feathers across the metal. Atlas slipped through the chase first, and emerged into the Crown House with a bark so sharp it sounded like a shot. The veteran followed and found the whole mountain gathered around one room. The Crown House sat above the basin on a concrete lip, half utility shed, half command post, and one wall had already been ripped outward by a controlled blast or the first shelf failure. Through that opening he could see Blackwater Lake below, dark under its broken ice skin, the east ridge above it split into staggered slabs, and beyond that the town sleeping under weak dawn lamps with no understanding of how close the mountain had come to rolling straight through its throat. On the far side of the room, framed by flying snow, hanging cables, and the cold blue light of disaster, stood the developer. He had blood on one sleeve where an earlier fight must have clipped him, and one hand on a charge switch box bolted to the manual release rail. The other held a pistol pointed low, not because he feared missing, but because men like him always preferred using the weapon second and the threat of it first. "I wondered how long your father would make you useful after he died," he shouted over the wind. The veteran advanced with the pistol leveled and the shepherd circling wide. "You killed him!" The developer gave him the thin smile of a man who had spent too many years watching consequences happen to other people. "I told him to step aside. Same thing I told every worker who forgot the world belongs to men with the capital to build it." His eyes flicked to the dog. "I'll give you one thing. That shepherd ruined half my clean endings." Atlas moved another pace left, white fur blowing wild, head low, every line of him reading the gap, the charge line, the tension in the developer's knees, the route to the hanging release rope beyond the cracked catwalk. The veteran saw where the dog was looking and understood the geometry too late for comfort. Beyond the Crown House, above the North Gorge, hung the emergency deflection wheel his father's map barely mentioned, one last manual override that could throw the first avalanche wave away from town if turned before the east shelf let go completely. But the catwalk to it was broken at the middle seam, two supports already half sheared, and the only thing reachable across the gap was a hanging rope attached to the frozen wheel assembly. The developer saw the realization in the veteran's face and laughed. "That route won't hold a man," he said. "And if you think I dragged all this cord and diesel up here for a negotiation, then retirement made you slower than the war did." He hit the charged plunger with the edge of his hand. Nothing happened. He looked startled for one honest second. Then the veteran smiled without humor and kicked the detonator battery pack he had already spotted and shot loose on his way in. It skidded out through the breach and vanished into the storm. Atlas launched at the same instant. The dog hit the developer square in the chest, drove him backward into the charge box, and the room became all movement, boots scraping, cables snapping, concrete dust falling, men grunting not like professionals but like animals finally forced to live at their own altitude. The veteran closed the distance and tore the pistol free while the developer fought like rich men fight once they understand the world may actually touch them, dirty, desperate, and stunned that strength can come from anything other than status. They went down against the rail. The developer tried for the veteran's bad shoulder. The veteran answered with an elbow across the mouth and a knee that folded him over hard enough to send blood across the concrete. Atlas had already shifted, not mauling, not losing his mind to violence, but keeping the developer's legs out from under him with precise crushing body checks every time he tried to rise. Below them the lake cracked. Above them the east shelf groaned. Then the radio in the veteran's vest burst with the geologist's voice. "The pressure is holding by almost nothing," she shouted. "If the first shelf wave goes to basin, the second rebound still kills the town unless north opens now." The veteran looked at the hanging rope. Looked at the gap. Looked at Atlas. The dog was already staring at the span with a terrible kind of understanding. "No," the veteran said before anything else moved, because love always sees the cost before the plan. The developer heard the word and laughed blood into his own teeth. "You're not sending the dog." The veteran hit him once, hard enough to shut him up, then dropped to one knee before Atlas and put both hands on the white fur at either side of the dog's face. "Listen to me," he said, forehead almost touching muzzle, while snow blasted through the breach and the whole Crown House leaned under the beginning collapse. "Rope. Pull. Come back." Atlas stared into him with the same pale, unblinking certainty he had shown on roads, in breaches, over bodies, beside children, through every season since war made them the only witnesses each other trusted. He had learned doors, scents, signals, blast patterns, stress, and sorrow. He understood enough. Maybe he understood too much. The veteran opened his hands. Atlas moved. The dog crossed the cracked catwalk with the impossible grace of something built to trust its own body in places men stopped deserving the term. Halfway over the left support popped with a metallic scream, and the span dropped. The developer let out a bark of laughter and panic combined. Atlas never broke stride. He leapt the last gap, landed on the far platform, locked his jaws onto the hanging rope, and threw his full weight backward. The first pull moved nothing. The second made the frozen wheel groan. The third tore blood from the dog's mouth and shifted the mechanism 1/4 turn. Then the mountain answered. The north gate slammed open somewhere beyond the wall. The east shelf let go in a white-black wall of snow, ice, and rock the size of judgment. It should have gone to town. Instead it began curling into the north gorge. The Crown House took the blast wave of displaced air like a fist. Concrete split under the veteran's boots. The developer tore free and lunged toward the gap, maybe for the dropped battery, maybe just from animal terror. But the veteran dragged him back and slammed him face down while Atlas fought the rope one final time until the deflection wheel locked into place. Then the far platform sheared away under the dog and dropped into the storm. The world became white noise and one terrible absence, and the veteran heard himself scream the shepherd's name as if a man could call love back upward out of a gorge by force of will alone. He would later remember the next few seconds in impossible fragments, not as one motion but as a scatter of images cut by terror, the rope whipping, the far platform folding, white fur vanishing, his own body moving without permission from thought, and the developer laughing once in disbelief because some men still mistook pain for theater even while the world was trying to bury them. The veteran threw himself onto the broken lip of the catwalk and felt it shift under his chest as the whole Crown House took the redirected avalanche load. Snow and shattered ice roared past the breach in a continuous white river. He looked down and saw Atlas not gone, not yet, but hanging by the release rope where it disappeared into a maintenance slot below the platform. The dog's forepaws clawed at concrete slick with ice. One hind leg kicked against open air. Blood darkened the white fur around his mouth where the rope had cut through gums and pried together. "Hold," the veteran heard himself say, though he did not know whether he was speaking to the dog, the rail, or the last usable part of himself. He clipped his climbing line around a cracked support, fed it with shaking hands, and lowered his upper body over the edge until his ribs screamed. Below him the north gorge took the avalanche in convulsing waves. If the rope snapped or the support failed, Atlas would not fall into snow. He would disappear into the moving machinery of winter. The veteran reached once and missed. reached again and caught harness webbing with 2 fingers. Atlas's full weight hit his shoulder like a weapon. Pain lit black along his spine. He refused it. Long ago, under broken concrete and smoke, he had let another living thing slide away because orders said timing mattered more. The years since had taught him a simple cruel truth: timing always mattered, but it was never the whole God men made it. He got one forearm under Atlas's chest and hauled. The dog kicked, found traction for half a second, lost it, then found it again. Together they scraped upward inch by inch until the veteran could drag him over the lip and into the crown house just as the last visible section of the catwalk tore loose and vanished. Atlas rolled, coughed blood from the rope burn, then tried to stand immediately. The veteran caught him, hands moving over ribs, shoulders, legs, searching for breaks. None obvious. Torn pad. Split gums. Bruised flank. Alive. The relief that hit him then was so violent it almost passed for anger. He pressed his forehead once to the white fur, and said nothing because language at that point would only have made the truth smaller. Behind him the developer tried to crawl. The veteran rose, hauled him upright by the collar, and wired his wrists with strip detonator line. "If you leave me here," the developer gasped, looking past him toward the blown wall and the gorge. "This place comes down on me." The veteran's face did not change. "Now you know how everyone else felt." Over the radio the geologist's voice came cracked with numbers. "North took the first slide. South is falling too fast now. The bleed wheel has to open or the gates slam and drive the surge under town." The veteran looked at the shattered Crown House control boards and understood the new disaster instantly. The redirected avalanche had saved the town from immediate burial, but the impact load had changed basin pressure so violently that the south diverter could still reverse and send the rebound through the lower wall unless a manual bleed was opened in the inner gallery below. The mountain was not done demanding intelligence from the living. Atlas stood at his leg again, blood still at the mouth, eyes clear as winter stars. "One more," the veteran said to the dog, not because Atlas needed words, but because men did. He left the developer bound to the support stanchion and followed the service markings into the inner gallery. This passage was worse than the upper shaft, narrower, colder, and cut along the active flow line where steel grates hovered above black water tearing itself through the spilled channel. Every step sent vibrations through boots and bone alike. Halfway along he found the wheel Dana's notes described, a rusted hand valve bolted to the bleed manifold, half iced over, stubborn with age and disuse. The geologist's voice in the radio had gone distant, counting gauge fields with the medic, trying to hold calm over static and the cries of the boy who still did not understand why adults kept leaving and returning out of the mountain like souls from 2 different worlds. The veteran wrapped both hands around the wheel and pulled. It did not move. He braced and pulled again until rust snapped and the metal began inching around with a scream that traveled through the pipes into the whole buried system. 1 turn. 2. 3. Pressure changed instantly below the grate, water hammering different, less like impact and more like release. Then a shot cracked behind him in the gallery. Concrete exploded off the wall near his head. He turned and found the sheriff at the access hatch, soaked, filthy, and still somehow clinging to the stupid hope that he could talk reality back into serving the powerful if he aimed enough violence at the people disproving it. The sheriff raised the pistol again, and the veteran ducked as the second round skipped off the valve housing. Atlas arrived before the third. The dog hit the sheriff's arm from the side with a force that sent the pistol through the grate into the channel. The sheriff screamed and crashed against the gallery rail, which sheared under his weight. For one suspended second he hung over the boiling water with both hands on the broken bar, eyes wide, every borrowed ounce of authority gone. "Help me!" he cried. The veteran stared down at him and saw not an officer, not law, just the kind of man who hid cowardice inside procedure until greed made him lethal. The sheriff babbled then, excuses and bargains, saying he never knew about the workers, never knew about the boy, never saw the depth of what the developer was doing. Perhaps some part of that was even true. Evil often survived by hiring men who asked only enough questions to keep their consciences technically breathing. The veteran dragged him back anyway, not from mercy exactly, but from fatigue with death and from the knowledge that living witnesses made stronger graves for lies than frozen bodies did. He bell-bound the sheriff to the pipe bracket, finished the bleed turns, and listened while the geologist on the radio gasped the words every engineer on a mountain prayed to hear. Pressure stabilizing. It's holding. It's actually holding. He leaned against the valve housing then, breath shaking harder than he wanted, and Atlas pressed against his leg with the same quiet certainty he had carried through firefights, bunkers, tunnels, and now a collapsing spillway. In the silence after the gauges calmed, the veteran understood something he had been resisting since Blackwater Lake. This story was never really about gold. Gold had only been the appetite. The real thing waiting beneath the ice had been judgment, on the town, on his father, on the men who sold safety for influence, on himself for believing leaving was always cleaner than staying. He took Atlas back toward the Crown House just in time to hear the developer screaming from where he was tied. Not in triumph now. In fear. The north support above the gorge was slipping farther than anyone calculated, and if the Crown House slid, the developer would go with it. The veteran could have left him. No lawman or jury would have questioned much in that weather with those charges and that damage. But the mountain had already asked him who he meant to be often enough for one life. He cut the developer free from the stanchion only to clip him into the extraction line, then dragged him through the shaft and down toward West Control where the medic, the geologist, the workers, and the boy were waiting under dirty yellow light. When the boy saw Atlas alive, he broke into tears so immediate and relieved that even the medic had to turn away for a second. The geologist looked at the blood around the dog's mouth, then at the veteran's face, and understood the rest without asking. He pulled it. She whispered. The veteran nodded once. He saved the town. She shook her head softly, looking at the dog leaning into the boy's shaking hands. He saved all of us. Above them, dawn had begun to thin the storm. Far away but climbing, they could hear sirens on the lower road. The first siren sounded like something impossible enough to mistrust, a thin wavering note rising through old stone and steel as if the outside world had finally remembered the mountain contained people and not just rumors. But by the second and third note even the wounded workers lifted their heads, and the medic, who had spent the whole night refusing hope unless she could wrap it in procedure, closed her eyes and let out one long breath that looked almost like surrender. State units, she said. County doesn't carry that tone. The veteran leaned against the West Control wall and let the information settle where adrenaline had been living. His hands were cut. His shoulder was barely listening to him anymore. Dried blood flaked dark on Atlas's muzzle where the rope had torn skin. The geologist looked 20 years older than the day before, but the angles of her face had shifted from hunted to purposeful. The boy had wrapped both arms around the shepherd's neck and seemed determined not to release him until daylight itself gave formal permission. The developer sat zip-tied against a pipe bracket under a blanket not because anyone in that room liked him enough to spare him cold, but because no one there wanted his death to make his lies more convenient. The sheriff stared at the floor, his authority gone so completely he looked smaller, almost unfinished, like the storm had washed the costume off and revealed the weak, frightened man under it at last. The mountain still muttered through the pipes and walls. It would do that for days, maybe months, settling, shifting, punishing all the math men had tried to force on it. But the catastrophic collapse had been diverted. The basin pressure had stabilized. The town still stood. Those facts felt too large to fit in the room. We need the surface road before county people get turned around by the sheriff's story, the geologist said. We need the workers visible. We need the key logs, your father's notes, the survey originals, and the charge lines photographed before Kessler's friends start calling this weather and bad engineering luck. She was right, which was one reason the veteran respected her. Trauma had not made her smaller. It had only made her more exact. He gathered everything that could still speak for the dead and the nearly dead, the brass lever, the map tube, the survey overlays, the geologist's notebook, his father's notes, the workers' badges, the developer's burner phone, the sheriff's service weapon retrieved from the gallery catch sump, and the written blasting orders they found in the developer's coat. Outside, dawn widened slowly through the storm, gray first, then blue, then the cold, honest light that made hiding look like work instead of magic. They came out of the chapel crawlspace in a staggered line, the medic and stronger worker supporting the injured one, the geologist with the notes under her coat, the boy with one mitten twisted deep in Atlas's fur, the veteran dragging the developer, and the sheriff behind him like two versions of the same local disease finally pulled into weather. St. Jude looked worse by daylight than it had in the dark. One side wall had bowed outward. The steeple leaned. Colored glass lay scattered in drifts like frozen pieces of old promises. But beyond the chapel, spread under the mountain in weak storm morning, the town still breathed. Plows moved on Main. Porch lights flicked off. People had come out into the street, and were staring upward toward the ruined east shelf where the avalanche scar gouged white down into the north gorge instead of through their homes. The rescue convoy reached the chapel road 20 minutes later, first state troopers, then county emergency vehicles behind them, then the kind of engineers and basin safety officers no town ever wanted to meet because they only arrived after people had been stupid with land and lucky with consequences. The trooper in front stepped out with his coat collar up against the wind, took one look at the bound developer, the zip-tied sheriff, the geologist under a blanket, the bloodied workers, the boy clinging to the white shepherd, and did not ask for the developer's version first. That alone told the veteran the mountain had shifted more than snow. Statements began before coffee. The geologist handed over her notes. The medic gave a timeline. The workers identified charge locations, supply routes, missing coworkers, and the names of men who had carried bars out under tarps at night. The veteran turned over the keys, the burner phone, the maps, and his father's notebook, then walked the troopers through the access routes beneath St. Jude, the under-ice hatch, the Crown House, the gallery, and the charge line. He kept his sentences short because the truth was heavy enough already. The developer tried twice to speak and twice the trooper told him to save it for the state investigator. The sheriff tried a softer version, a procedural version, a version where everyone moved too fast in bad weather and the stakes stacked into tragedy. No one in that circle looked at him like a sheriff anymore. That mattered more than cuffs. Atlas stayed close to the boy through all of it until the county medic, a woman old enough to recognize something sacred when it kept a child breathing, finally told the ambulance crew to make room for the dog. "He rides where the boy rides," she said, and for once no one argued policy. The boy looked up at the veteran then with the swollen-eyed seriousness only frightened children and dying old men ever really mastered. "He'll come too?" he asked, meaning the dog, not the veteran, and the question struck deeper than gunfire because it revealed the one truth the veteran had been pushing away since the first tunnel. Atlas no longer belonged only to his past. He belonged now to everyone he had carried through the mountain. The veteran crouched beside them and touched the dog once behind the ears. "For now," he said, because promises felt different after a night like that. The geologist, already being loaded onto a stretcher, heard him and gave a tired, knowing look over the oxygen mask. The medic saw it too but said nothing. She only handed the veteran a paper cup of black coffee so hot it burned the cuts in his fingers and stood beside him while the ambulances started down the road. The town itself came later carefully, in little clusters behind tape lines and trooper shoulders. Men from the diner. Women from the school. Board members in parkas too expensive for weather. The cousin who had thrown the duffel into the snow. Faces lifted toward the ridge, toward the developer being loaded into a state vehicle, toward the sheriff being stripped of his sidearm and badge under open sky. The veteran had expected hostility or relief. What he saw instead was something smaller, and uglier and maybe more useful, recognition. Not just that the developer had lied, but that the town had been participating in the lie every time it chose comfort over questions. One old mechanic shook his head and said to nobody in particular, "We heard blasts at night, and told ourselves it was progress." A teacher beside him said, "We heard about the geologist disappearing and told ourselves adults had reasons." The medic answered before the veteran could. "That's the thing about reasons. Cowards usually call them that first." No one argued. Snow kept falling in light needles through all of it, but the storm had lost its threat. By afternoon the first news crews arrived from the county seat, then the second wave from the city, because stories about corruption, avalanches, veterans, and dogs moved faster through the public imagination than any engineering report ever could. The veteran refused every camera. The geologist, however, once she could sit up in the clinic bed, asked for one official statement to be recorded and gave it with her arm in a sling and Atlas sleeping at the boy's feet beneath the blanket warmer. She told them about the ridge instability, the forged permits, the missing workers, the Underlake vault, the murdered father who tried too late but tried anyway, and the shepherd who led a broken soldier toward the only route that could still save the town. By evening the story belonged to no single man anymore, not the veteran, not his father, not even the developer who had mistaken ownership for immunity. It belonged to the people still alive because the dog had heard what greed hoped ice would hide. The veteran spent that evening at the clinic because the medic asked him to and because leaving would have felt too much like obeying an old reflex. The boy slept with one hand on Atlas's shoulder. The geologist drifted in and out under pain medication. The stronger worker gave a statement to the state. The injured one kept weeping in short, embarrassed bursts every time his wife came into the room and touched his hair, as if checking he had not already become memory. Near midnight the medic found the veteran in the corridor staring out at the parking lot where plows sat lined in orange light like exhausted animals. "You're thinking of leaving before they ask you to belong to this again," she said. He looked at her, surprised mostly because she still knew exactly where the knife went in. "I don't know how to stay where things remember me wrong," he admitted. She leaned beside him, arms folded, just another tired body under hospital fluorescence. Except to him, she was still also the girl who used to bandage his knuckles in gym hallways and ask why he looked lonelier in crowds than alone. "Then stay where the dog lies down," she said. "He seems to have better judgment than either of us." The veteran looked through the glass into the dim room beyond, where Atlas slept between the boy's bed and the geologist's chair like a white line drawn against fear itself, and for the first time since coming home he allowed the thought to land without immediately pushing it away. Maybe being thrown out with nothing had not left him with nothing after all. The first time the veteran tried to sleep after the mountain gave up its dead and spared its living, he made it 23 minutes before waking in the dark with the taste of concrete dust in his mouth and one hand already reaching for a rifle that was not there. For a few wild seconds he was back in the Crown House with Atlas gone over the edge and Mason Vega bleeding in another decade under another collapsing weight, and then the present returned in softer pieces. The clinic heating vent, the throb in his shoulder, the storm finally thinning outside, and the white shepherd asleep across the threshold of the geologist's room because even exhausted to the edge of collapse, Atlas still chose guard over comfort. The veteran sat on the hallway bench until dawn and watched the dog breathe. In war they had assigned the shepherd to him because he was the one operator who never treated the animal like equipment. After war the dog had stayed because the world had cracked them open in compatible ways. But in the pale hospital light of the day after the avalanche, he understood something about Atlas that every person who loved him would eventually have to accept. The dog belonged wherever fear was most desperate and silence most dangerous. Right now that was with the boy. The town had entered the second stage of disaster by then, the part after immediate survival when paperwork, accusation, engineering, and shame began their slower avalanche. State police sealed the Ridge Road. Basin experts flew in by noon. County board members who once toasted the developer as the future of Blackwater Lake suddenly discovered language like oversight failure and unauthorized access. The sheriff's office was placed under external review. Search crews found the first two missing workers in a lower spoil chamber by afternoon, dead long enough for the town to understand that the story had been rotting for months before the storm ever made it urgent. More reports surfaced after that: invoices, fuel receipts, forged signatures, bribe transfers, unfiled safety complaints, quiet little papers that meant nothing alone and everything when laid side by side like bars of the same cursed gold. The geologist gave her formal interview on the second day with the veteran beside the bed and the medic against the wall. She spoke of fault lines and false permits, of basin pressure and greed dressed as development, of how a town can get so hungry for rescue from its own poverty that it mistakes predation for prosperity. Then she looked at the veteran and said, in front of troopers, engineers, and a county prosecutor who had driven up from the city, "Your father spent the last week of his life trying to become better than the man he had been for 20 years. I think you should know that." The veteran's throat tightened in a way it never did under interrogation or report review. "Did he say that?" She shook her head. "No. Men like him rarely say the clean version. But he hid food in 3 tunnels, left notes in 4 places, and kept one route sealed until he believed only the right person would find it. That's confession in mountain language." He took that truth the way people take medicine they know they need but never would have chosen on their own. Later that day they found another piece of the father in the evidence bag from the chapel crawlspace, a short cassette marked only with the son's rank from years ago. The veteran listened to it alone in the clinic supply room. His father's voice came rough and tired through static, older than memory and sadder than pride ever let him sound in life. He said he had spent too many winters confusing hardness with honor, that he had watched his son leave and called it necessary because admitting love late felt more humiliating than silence, that when the geologist showed him what the developer was doing to the ridge, he finally understood what cowardice looked like in old men, not fear of death, but fear of admitting you should have stood up sooner. Then the tape clicked and his father said the sentence that undid him more completely than any apology might have. "If the dog still trusts you, then maybe there's more left in you than you think." The veteran sat in the supply room with that tape in his lap and for the first time in years let grief move all the way through him instead of around him. It was not loud. It did not look noble. It looked like a man with his head bowed over a folding table while fluorescent light hummed and winter held its breath outside. When he came out, the medic didn't ask. She only handed him coffee and walked with him in silence to the children's room where the boy was awake, and Atlas had one heavy white paw draped over the blanket as if claiming the bed by emotional right. The geologist's condition improved enough by the 3rd day for humor to return in small dry pieces. "I'm told the reporters want the dog's name more than mine," she said, watching Atlas through the half-open door. "That's because the dog didn't bury any permit complaints in county files," the medic answered. The boy laughed then, the first laugh the veteran had heard from him, small and fragile but real enough to make everyone in the room go still for a second. The veteran found himself smiling without permission. The medic saw it and looked away too quickly for it to be accident. Outside the clinic, Blackwater Lake had become a place of machines and evidence flags. Dive teams went under the broken ice and found the payroll vault exactly where the geologist's notes said it would be, gold bars stacked in mud and freezing dark under a century of greed and myth. The discovery detonated through the media faster than the explosives ever had through rock. Suddenly the town had not just a corruption scandal, but a legend made literal beneath the lake. There were calls for federal seizure, county reward claims, historical ownership disputes, and one very loud faction already talking about tourist recovery and memorial attractions as if the mountain hadn't just nearly buried them for that exact appetite. The veteran listened to that from the clinic window and felt the same old disgust rise. Gold, he realized, had not waited beneath the ice like a blessing. It had waited like bait. The shepherd, meanwhile, remained gloriously uninterested in wealth, politics, or legend. He cared about open doors, frightened breathing, footsteps in hallways, and whether the boy woke shaking at 3 a.m. He cared about the geologist's pulse slowing when she slept. He cared about the medic's hand when she crouched to clean the torn pad and speak to him like an equal. He cared, in short, about the exact things human beings most often failed to prioritize until disaster embarrassed them into honesty. On the 4th day the town held the father's funeral in the school gym because the Ridge Chapel was condemned and the weather still too unstable for a graveside service on the mountain. The veteran almost did not go. Then the boy asked if the white dog would be there, and that made the answer for him. He stood at the front with Atlas seated beside his leg and looked out over rows of parkas, stiff collars, red eyes, and the faces of people who had spent too long letting one man by their weather. He spoke briefly because long speeches often disguised cowardice better than silence did. He said his father had been difficult, proud, often wrong, and too late in too many ways, but at the end he had still climbed back into the storm for people who needed him more than his excuses did. He said the mountain did not care what anyone owned. It only cared what held when the weight came down. Then he stepped back and let the room decide which sentences belonged to them. After the service, the cousin who had thrown his duffel into the snow approached him outside with eyes swollen from either grief or the sudden discovery of his own size. He tried twice to speak and failed both times. The veteran spared him the performance. "I remember," he said, not cruelly, just truthfully, and walked past. That evening the geologist was discharged from critical care into county protective housing. The boy would go with her until his status hearing and then, if the state had any sense at all, stay there longer. The question none of them wanted to ask hovered in the room anyway: what happened to the dog now? The boy looked at the veteran. The geologist looked at Atlas. The medic looked at all three and wisely said nothing. The veteran knelt in front of the shepherd, put both hands against the white fur at his neck, and waited. Atlas stared at him, then at the boy, then back at him. There was no command in the room and no leash tugging the answer one way or another. The dog stepped first toward the boy, touched his muzzle once to the child's chest, then turned and came to the veteran's side and sat. The boy cried quietly. The geologist put a hand over her mouth. The medic exhaled like she had been holding that breath since the ridge road. The veteran closed his eyes for 1 second and rested his forehead against Atlas's, not because the dog had chosen him over the others, but because the choice itself meant the animal believed there was still work ahead. "We'll come back," he told the boy. It was the first promise of the future he had made in years without feeling like a liar. The child nodded against Atlas's fur and whispered, "I know." Outside, the snow had stopped. For the first time since he came home, the veteran could see the whole face of the mountain in evening light, scarred, unstable, dangerous, and still somehow beautiful enough to break a man open if he looked too long. He stood there with the shepherd pressed warm against his leg and understood the simplest truth the whole town had spent years avoiding. Survival was not the end of the story. It was only the part where the living finally became responsible for what came next. Winter did not leave Blackwater Lake quickly after the storm, but it did change character, and so did the man who had once believed leaving was the only honest talent he had. The weeks that followed turned the town inside out. The state seized the payroll gold under emergency historical claim, then, after enough hearings and enough fury from families of the dead and nearly buried, designated a large portion of its recovered value to basin stabilization, worker restitution, and the rescue infrastructure the developer had spent years pretending private money could replace. The resort project died under injunction. The sheriff resigned in disgrace before the formal removal could finish. The cousin sold his share of whatever little remained in the family dispute and left before mud season. Engineers dynamited safe sections, shored unstable ones, and posted enough warning signs along the ridge to make even the most stubborn locals admit that the mountain had been speaking clearly all along. It was people who preferred muffled translations. The veteran helped with the search crews first because helping with your hands is easier than sitting still while grief learns your new address. He knew snowpack, understood radios, moved well in bad terrain, and followed the shepherd's nose into places maps still hesitated to bless. Atlas took to the new rhythm with the grave enthusiasm only useful creatures ever truly understand. He ranged ahead of probe lines, warned on weak bridges, found 2 stranded snowmobilers in one wide-out gully and a missing old woman from the valley road in another, and each rescue added a quiet layer to the town's understanding that the white shepherd was not a mascot for survival stories. He was survival in motion. The medic saw the change in the veteran before he admitted it himself. He stopped scanning every room for exits first. He began lingering after coffee on her clinic porch instead of escaping before warmth felt dangerous. He repaired the lower ranger shack the county offered him on temporary use and then, without ever making a speech about it, kept improving it as if temporary had quietly become a lie both of them were willing to tolerate. The geologist came by often once her arm healed enough for field notes again. The boy came with her every other weekend under foster review, and the first thing he did every time was drop to one knee in the snow, while Atlas walked straight into his arms like no time had passed at all. Some bonds did not ask permission from law. They simply continued. The veteran honored that by making the promise he had offered in the clinic: real visits, ridge walks, radio checks, even one quiet afternoon on the frozen shore after spring took the danger out of Blackwater Lake, when the boy asked if the gold had really been beautiful and the veteran said yes, but not nearly beautiful enough to be worth what men had traded for it. The boy considered that for a while, looking at Atlas chewing peacefully on a branch, then said, "I think the dog knew that before everyone else." The veteran smiled and answered, "He usually does." When the thaw came and the last dirty ice broke against the spillway stones, they held a memorial by the repaired lower road for the missing workers and the dead father who had died too late, and still not too late enough to stop matching. The veteran spoke there too, but differently than at the funeral. This time he did not speak only of loss. He spoke of warning, of what happened when towns outsourced conscience to wealth, of how storms only exposed what people had already decided to ignore. He said every mountain asked a question eventually, not in words, but in weight, and the answer was never what people claimed to believe. It was what held when the pressure came down. Then, because honesty had become less frightening than silence, he said one more thing in front of everyone, that he had spent years thinking the dog saved him by staying at his side, but the truth was uglier and better: the dog saved him by refusing to let him keep choosing distance over duty. The shepherd, bored by speeches as always, yawned in the middle of that sentence, and made half the crowd laugh through tears. Even the medic smiled openly. That was how spring finally entered the story, not through weather reports, but through the return of laughter that did not betray seriousness, only prove it had survived. By summer, the state signed off on a new basin rescue program, small, underfunded, practical, and badly needed. The veteran was asked to advise, then to train volunteers, then to stay on through winter as operations lead, because mountain towns always waited until after crisis to discover they preferred competence to ceremony. He accepted not because authority had become attractive, but because he had finally run out of reasons to pretend he belonged somewhere else more honestly. The medic stayed exactly where she had always stayed, in the town, at the clinic, inside every emergency worth meeting. The geologist took the county survey chair after refusing it twice. The boy's placement became permanent under her roof after the hearings closed. And Atlas, who would have laughed if dogs laughed at bureaucracy, simply continued being what none of their paperwork could adequately describe: a white shepherd who knew the sound of fear under ice, the scent of lies in tunnels, and the shape of a man trying very hard not to heal. The first major storm of the next winter hit before dawn on a Thursday. The radio at the ranger shack crackled with reports of a stranded school bus on the North Cut and a delivery truck off the Basin Road. The veteran was out of bed before the second call, boots half-laced, map board under one arm, the other hand already finding the old practice place on the dog's neck. Atlas was waiting at the truck door as if he had been awake the whole time, pale eyes fixed on the storm beyond the windshield, calm now where once he had carried all the urgency. The difference mattered. Urgency belonged to fear. Calm belonged to purpose. The veteran looked down the road toward town lights blurred by snow and saw not the place that threw him out with nothing, but the place that nearly died and then had to learn the price of being kept alive. In the distance, the clinic porch light came on. A figure in a heavy coat stepped outside with a radio in one hand and another cup in the other, and though the storm swallowed detail, he knew who it was by posture alone. He smiled despite himself, took the cup when she reached the truck, and heard her say through the snow, "Try not to make a habit of saving everybody before breakfast." "No promises," he said, and for once humor did not feel like betrayal. Atlas gave one short impatient bark from the passenger seat, not at either of them, but at the storm, because there were still people somewhere out there losing heat and hope at the same speed. The veteran nodded, turned the key, and the engine woke. The road ahead vanished into white almost immediately, just as it had on the night this story began. But he was not the same man now, and the dog beside him was no longer just the last witness to a broken life. He was partner, compass, conscience, and the living proof that loyalty could do more than comfort the wounded. It could make them useful again. As the truck rolled out and the town lights fell behind them, the veteran rested one gloved hand on the shepherd's shoulder and felt steady warmth under thick winter fur. The mountain waited. The storm waited. Somewhere ahead another life would depend on whether he arrived in time. He looked once at the dog, then forward into the dark, and drove not like a man escaping home, but like a man finally answering it.